hinted a little bit earlier that we were going to make this a do event, not just a talk event. In advance of this panel, we'd like to make what I think is a really, really exciting announcement. So, today we are delighted to announce the launch of ReFlood, a coalition of companies, organizations, landowners, and individuals committed to expanding the use of natural flood management as a way to protect communities and the environment. ReFlood will seek to use innovative finance to significantly expand the use of wetlands and other forms of natural flood management to protect homes, assets, and infrastructure from the known risks of flooding, while seeking to maximize multiple environmental co-benefits such as carbon sequestration, biodiversity gain, and water quality management. The initial members of ReFlood include Howden, Zurich, Flood Re, the Crown Estate, the National Trust, National Highways, Barclays, Nattergull, and Planetary X. We're also in dialogue with the Environment Agency, which plays a vital role as an investor in the nation's anti-flood defenses. ReFlood is part of the Conduit's Solutions Agenda, a recently announced set of initiatives convened by the Conduit, which is intended to accelerate some of the world's most pressing problems. Solutions to some of the world's most pressing problems. Other solutions agenda initiatives include a major conference on the first day of London Climate Action Week on the relationship between public health and the climate crisis in partnership with the Wellcome Trust, the Green Economy Forum, the third in a series of major convenings the Conduit has held every November aimed at supporting and accelerating a just transition in the United Kingdom, and Resilient Cities, a convening in partnership with the Resilient Cities network of mayors and chief resilience officers from over 40 cities across the globe, designed to allow them to share best practices and cross-sell solutions offered by for-profit companies and not-for-profit organizations in each of their cities that help produce resilience in the spheres of public health, the environment, the economy, and good governance. We launched the Solutions Agenda because of a conviction that the world's greatest challenges are better understood as solutions waiting to happen. We want to use the Conduit's convening power to catalyze and accelerate action. And we're confident that ReFlood will quickly demonstrate the power of its members to transform the catastrophic risks of flooding into a force that protects communities, houses, and infrastructure, while demonstrating that natural flood management can create a natural asset class with climate co-benefits and significant revenue streams. And I'm therefore delighted to welcome onto stage a remarkable group of people drawn from the founding members of ReFlood to discuss how we're going to make that happen. And the first is Harry from the National Trust. And I'm going to give the National Trust a big shout out here because I think over a year ago, we held an event at the Conduit as part of our partnership with the National Trust, in which Harry, and again, I'll call out Claudine and Aviva, give a big shout out to them, spoke about this work that they were doing in the reestablishment of wetlands. And that set about the germ of the idea that has led to this coalition. So, Harry, tell us more about your work in that regard.
Thank you, Paul, and great to be here. So I thought what I'd do, Paul, if that's okay, is just a tiny bit about why we're interested in this agenda, and then I'm going to give a bit of nature sparkle beyond my shirt, if that's all right, and show you some images of three examples that the Trust is involved with, either directly or indirectly, that might bring this work to life. So we were formed a long time ago, in part to protect nature for the people of this country. And 130 years have rolled by, and I would say, rather depressingly, we've slightly failed in that task. And my boss isn't listening, I'm hoping. And a large part of that is about fresh waters. So if you look at the state of nature in the UK, which is in real peril, we're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. As a subset of that, our freshwaters are in real peril. And what I mean by that is our rivers and our lakes and our ponds, etc. And just to bring that to life with one specific stat, there are no rivers in England in what's known as good ecological health. So, having failed in that work, we're beginning to think, well, what is a system-wide sectoral approach to the stuff that we're bothered about, which is nature and the benefits that accrue from that for the nation, and we're particularly thinking about that in a river and watery environment. So, can you bring up my slides, please? And I'll just canter through three examples. Are they behind us? Yeah. So the first of these in the Lake District. This is a river, euphemistically in this slide called a river, acting as a drain called the Goldrill Beck, which was improved for agricultural purposes 100 so years ago, and it's basically a channel for water to disperse downstream. Now, in 2016, those with a long memory remember the Storm Desmond impact, where it had pretty catastrophic impacts on people and communities in Cumbria. And that was a real catalyst in this place to take this river and reconnect it with its floodplain. You can see how it's acting on right by the road there as a drain. This is now what it looks like after reconnecting it with its floodplain. So that's brilliant for nature. We've got a lot more wetland habitat created there, but actually really interestingly in terms of this is the flood response downstream. And what this graph shows is how long it takes floodwater to disperse now from the floodplain, and the height of the flood is much lower downstream now as a result of this work. The next one, and in some ways these become progressively more interesting, I think. This is Honeycutt in Somerset, where we've taken a practice from Oregon in the States called Stage 0 river restoration, where we've basically allowed a river to reimagine itself as it would have been post-glaciation. And what effectively that's meant is filling the river in, much more technical than that, but basically filling the river in and allowing it to re-find its channel. And you can see that is brilliant. You can imagine that is brilliant for nature. You go there in the summer and it is absolutely hooching with the sounds of insects and birds. And this is the sort of impact that it's had. It's taken what was a drainage channel and turned it into an extraordinary wetland, which is now attracting things like white-tailed eagles. So that's brilliant from a nature perspective, but again, working with the University of Exeter, this is a year on from that work. It's having a really significant impact on downstream flooding and other things like turbidity in the water. So this is only a year old, and so far on the last big flood event, we saw a 36% reduction in the height of the flood emerging from that land. And then the third, and this is really close to home for me, I live in Sheffield, so this is the grey to green intervention in Sheffield, which is taking the city a bit by storm. So Sheffield really impacted by floods, particularly in 2007, 2 deaths, millions of pounds worth of property damage, in part driven by lack of surface porosity, i.e. water just flowing off roads. So this is a reimagining about what natural flood management might look like in a city. It's having really good impacts on flooding. It's also cheaper than conventional over a 10-year frame, and it's also being, interestingly, really effective at reducing pollutants. It's also, and this is really matters to me as a citizen of the city, it's just a really beautiful place that is great to hang out. So this was a dual carriageway a few years ago and is now a linear park in the city. So I'm going to stop there and hand on.
So you can imagine when you hear these sort of anecdotes of what the National Trust has been able to do, it's crying out for scaling. The power of these wetlands to have climate co-benefits, to have all these biophilic benefits for people in cities, and to avoid flooding in ways that are remarkable at a lower price per investment, says there's something magical about these. Which brings me on to the Crown Estate. the Conduit has for a couple of years now worked with the Crown Estate, and we were incredibly lucky to be introduced to Caroline, who has, as you're about to see, deep expertise in this precise subject matter. And what we've been seeking to do is stitch together the largest and aggregate landowner in the country in the form of the National Trust, the Crown Estate, which is right up there, but also acts for the public benefit, to put these together into this coalition. And so, Caroline, I'd like to ask, why is this of interest to you? Why is the Crown Estate on the stage, and why is this something that you think you have a contribution to make on?
Thanks, Paul, and hi everyone. Lovely to see you, and really pleased to be part of this super important conversation. So the Crown Estate is interested in being a part of this conversation for a few reasons, and I'll try and explain them briefly. Firstly, as you've highlighted, we, like the National Trust, are a landowner, and we have a whole series of assets that we look after. That's, you know, rural agricultural land, Windsor Great Park, and then we also have a really important role looking after the land that we manage on the foreshore as well. So we have a really interesting set of interests, if you like, that sits across the system that Harry spoke about, starting right up at the top of the catchment, taking us all the way down through and into the coastal hinterlands, estuaries and beyond. So the concept of flooding and natural flood management links those things together so perfectly. And if you take that together with the ambition that we have around restoring and recovering nature, which is another really important part of our role, and we work with myriad partners on this, many of whom are in the room, the co-benefits when you start looking at how do you address the challenge of flooding for communities and people that work and live in and around the land, and the benefits that thinking about that in a habitat lens or through a biodiversity lens, if you will, that then links us through to in terms of delivering some really exciting outcomes for nature. You know, those things come together perfectly in this conversation, and that's why it's really important. I think the other thing that I probably should mention in this as well, and it's true for all landowners, I would suggest, which is that when we think about what's happening with our changing climate, and particularly with sea level rises and the increasing risks that we're seeing, not just at the coast, but, you know, in the riparian environment as well, it's no doubt that the nature of the assets that sit at that forefront is going to change in the coming decades. And we need to understand what that looks like. We need to understand how we can adapt and change the way that we manage and interact with that land in a way that is sustainable. And that's everything from, if you're looking at agricultural land, for example, in the Humber, where sea level rise is going to lead to saline intrusion, which is going to change the way that you can farm that land. But it also means it's going to change the way that that really critical habitat for wading birds, you know, is going to contribute to that area. And I think also then if you think about introducing improved sinuosity through rivers in things like the Windsor Great Park, it's a completely different challenge that interacts with communities in a totally different way, but all comes under that umbrella of how do we manage these really important and valuable assets so that it can continue to deliver value for everybody who wants to use them.
So before we come on to Jonathan and to Fladri, I'll just add another part of this important initiative is National Highways. And National Highways has a partnership and is supportive of the National Trust. And one of the facts that I was astonished by in conversations with colleagues at the National Highways is that 90+% of the roads in the United Kingdom are built on an engineering standard that sort of predates the advent of extreme weather events like flooding. So this critical infrastructure is also critically vulnerable. And the UK's finances are simply not in a position to be able to upgrade all of these roads all at the same time. So natural flood management is going to become an absolutely essential part of how we address this risk to critical infrastructure. And National Highways is part of a coalition of other big infrastructure players, including HS2, including Heathrow, who are equally vulnerable. So now it turns to the question of, we have landowners who are ready and willing for a whole bunch of obvious reasons. How do you go about thinking about financing the rollout of these wetlands? And how might you do so in a way that doesn't subject us to this tyranny of small, isolated, subscale interventions? How would you do this so that you could build out 1,000 wetlands and create a whole bulwark of these anti-flood defenses. And so for that, we're going to speak to Flood Re in the form of Jonathan.
Hi. And so several of the speakers earlier mentioned Flood Re, so that makes my job a bit easier because a lot of what we do is actually much more in the home space, in the physical risk space. People talked about Build Back Better, but it's worth saying we are a partnership between government and insurers. We're paid for by insurers, but government sets the rules. And despite that focus on physical risk measures for homes, I get to spend a bit of my time on nature because we see NFM as an underutilized tool in the risk reduction toolkit. And let's see. Yeah, great. So my background is in climate and energy. And 15, 20 years ago, conversations in the renewable space would have been a lot like the one today, saying, how do we get big investment? How do we get pension funds? How do we get institutional assets into renewables? And so what did that business model look like? Well, it looked more, this is a mock-up of it, which is like stacked revenue streams in a few small variable areas with government guaranteed revenue streams. So the feed-in tariff, contract for difference, basically a government paid revenue stream that makes up for all the externalities and also makes it an investable proposition by de-risking it. So that's what most of these look like, and as Rebecca said this morning, you know, there's a $100 billion commitment from insurers to invest over the next 10 years in assets, which include this. So this is an asset class, this is how it got there. What could this look like for nature? Pretty similar. So all of these revenue streams exist, so carbon credits, water quality, et cetera. And those are small variable revenue streams. It's debatable whether food would be on this balance sheet or on another balance sheet, but it's part of the ecosystem. And then at the bottom, you'd have an NFM payment. So we view that as primarily a government responsibility. So when Flood Re was created, there was also, as the Environment Agency said earlier, a commitment for government to pay for flood defenses, because for Flood Re to stop existing, we stop existing in 2039. The risks have to come down. To do that, there needs to be investment in flood measures. So that NFM payment essentially could do what a contract for difference or feed-in tariff does. It makes it an investable proposition. Why would government do this? Well, right now, if they do NFM, they pay 100% of the cost. Not quite, but effectively they're the, you know, when you build a dam, government built it in its entirety, small amount of contribution. This crowds in a lot of other investment. So it means they're not paying the majority. It does shift it from capital spending over to operational or funding, but ultimately it crowds in all those other investors or other payment streams. So can this be done? Yes. There's a project called the Wire Valley NFM project, which was led by the Rivers Trust, and we were one of the partners. This is a multi-partner, multi-benefit revenue stream model, and it is exactly that. You know, there were investors in that. We were a research partner, essentially to prove that this, you know, proof of concept that this works. Proof of concept that the business model works, which it does, and then proof of concept that that the interventions work. And I kind of like the distinction between this really complicated financial business model and the fact that this is like sticks in a river. But that's what we're talking about, and actually it does. It slows the flow of water. It doesn't replace what engineered defenses do, but it does what it does really well at really low cost. So the ultimate proposition for this is that it should be a government responsibility. Part of that agreement is insurance premium tax provides about $10 billion per year, and notionally some of that is earmarked for risk reduction. The Environment Agency spends about $800 million on flood defenses a year. Over the last 10 years on NFM, I think it's spent about 40 to 50 million. So that's basically half of 1%. And if it were its own documents, they have something called the long-term investment strategies, which lays out what they should be investing in over the next 5 years. That says 5 to 7% could be from NFM. So that would represent a 10-fold scaling up of their investment. Crowding in all that additional funding, you're talking 20, 25% increase in the skies. That's how you scale it. But it does require government getting into it. The minister, the floods minister has said this is a priority for them. So, you know, it's coming. Oh, and it's worth saying, I have a similar graph showing that, yes, it did work. The goal was 10% reduction in peak flows, but actually it was more like 25%. So this stuff works really well. We can get on with doing it, and hopefully it looks something a little bit like this. That's it.
So to kind of recap and then tee up Nick Stace from Barclays, you have an asset that is cost effective, has climate co-benefits, assists with flood reduction, and is drastically underfinanced from a public finance point of view. Less than 0.5% of EA money goes to this, but you have a multi-billion pound expenditure in aggregate across the United Kingdom in anti-flood defences. If you take the EA and national highways alone, you're well into $1 billion plus of expenditure. And then you have all these aggregated other pockets of capital. And the one thing that is dramatically underspent on is NFM. So Nick, you head sustainability at Barclays. Why would you be interested in this particular topic?
Well, firstly, Paul, thank you for inviting us and all the sponsors as well. I think this is a really good example of the conduit really at its best, bringing an extraordinary group of people together, identifying a major problem in the world, coming up with solutions, and then collaborating around how we might work together on that. So thank you for doing this. The second thing I'd say is that this morning I think it's been incredible. I mean, I've learned an immense amount. And one thing I've also learned is who knew that insurance was cool? And it really does feel that way. It feels like the insurance industry, the banking sector, but also all of us in this room who are not necessarily part of that can be part of these extraordinary solutions. So Barclays, and why would we play our part, or the banking sector more generally? Because I think the important thing is here, I'm not really here just to represent Barclays. I think there is room for all banks to play a part here, so this shouldn't be just exclusive to us. There are a few things. I mean, firstly, we all agree, I think, that there's a problem that needs solving. I mean, the problem was outlined brilliantly earlier by Barnaby, where he talked about the fact that there are 6 million properties at risk of flooding at the moment in the UK. That will rise by the mid-century to 8 million. And for us, just looking at it from a parochial point of view, we have 20 million customers, most of whom have homes. We've got 1.2 million small businesses, all at risk, potentially directly or indirectly from flooding. We've got 38,000 farmers that bank with us that also have risks themselves, but also can be part of the solution. So we feel like we've got a massive stake in helping to make this work. We've also got increasing risk. Whenever I attend the monthly risk meetings at Barclays, floods comes up as pretty high up the risk register. So we've got something that we really need to tackle ourselves. So secondly, and this is really over the last few months, and I used to work with Harry. I was on the board of the National Trust for a number of years, completely separate to my work at Barclays, but have seen the work that the National Trust have done over that time. And I've personally, therefore, seen some of the interventions that have begun to work. And I think we feel at Barclays that this could be a game changer. Now, it doesn't mean that the other defence sort of grey infrastructure, I think it's called, where you create dams and drainage and so on, aren't important. They are. But they're expensive, and in many cases, they are being overwhelmed by the floods that we're having and that we will have in the future. And so we see this as a great complement to those other defence mechanisms and something that can be scaled. And the sort of scale I think that the conduit's speaking about here is anywhere between 500 and 1,000 sites across the UK, which gives you a sense of kind of the impact that this might have. So the second thing is we really feel this has a game-changing dimension to it. And I think, Paul, in the conversations we've had with 40+ organisations now, I mean, that is, that many of them agree with us. The third thing is that we think Barclays and other banks, as I say, for that matter, can help to scale those benefits. And those benefits are everything from the nature markets that have just been explained just a few moments ago. So the nature credits, carbon credits, biodiversity credits, clean water credits, carbon capture. There's an immense amount there that if we can capture that and monetize that, then that can also feed into the system to help create more wetlands as well. And we've got evidence in other parts of the world where this has worked and is working. So in our team, Barclays is someone who's spent the last decade working in the Netherlands, where, I mean, interestingly, and a very interesting statistic, in the Netherlands, people, of course, you might imagine, worry about flooding. Actually, they worry about it at the lowest levels in Europe. 6% of the public are worried about flooding in the Netherlands, partly because they've got a real handle on it. The place that worries about flooding most of all is Spain across Europe, at over 50%. So you've got a sense that it is possible if you collaborate with others, work with others, and come up with these kind of solutions to meet the challenge that's set, but also satisfy public concern as well. So we want to sort of lean into this. I would say it's not going to be without its challenge. I think we've all outlined sort of how possible it is, but I think we should say there's an awful lot we probably don't know at this stage. And the next few months, and we've set aside, I think, for the rest of the year with this steering committee, we'll be working very seriously to understand how it can happen and why it hasn't happened before, and to try and overcome some of the complexities that exist.
So thank you very much. And I wanted to underscore a point you made. The whole idea of this convening is to make it open source and accessible to everybody. This is the initial group of co-conspirators who are launching this, but banks, landowners, insurance companies, data companies, project engineers, people in the measurement space are all very welcome. And as part of what we want to do today and why we're excited to announce it is to invite this really remarkable audience that we've assembled. If you're interested, come and speak to us, because there will be several work streams that we will set up around this to try and bring this to scale. And this is going to require a collaborative effort. So let's go back to where we started, because one of the things that Harry mentioned to me in one of our sidebar conversations was that their insurance claims for flooding and subsidence on National Trust properties had been going through the roof because of flooding. And the irony of all ironies is the National Trust was also solving this, but having to deal with this as a real issue on its properties. So for the largest landowner to be an enthusiast around this, one of the things that we would seek to do is to try and both help you finance the building of these wetlands, cut through some of the kind of regulatory challenges, because I think you have said that some of the wetlands that you've been involved in, they cost twice as much as they should have, because there were a whole bunch of Byzantine regulations which made it inexpensive and inefficient to do so. But also try create a revenue stream from those wetlands to support the work of the National Trust, but to support the maintenance of those wetlands as well on your properties. So you wouldn't have to fund more to maintain them, but it would also create some revenue to support the remarkable work you have to keep land inalienable for future generations. Does that capture the sort of ways in which we would be good custodians to you, Harry, and serve some of your needs and meet some of your needs?
So there's a really short answer to that, which is yes, yes, please, Paul. So I'll just pick up one of those, actually, because I think there's a moment in time that everyone in the audience can bend their minds to. It's the whole regulatory set of arrangements. So we have systematized, particularly in our upper catchments, we've systematized through all sorts of regulation and a drive, quite rightly, for agricultural production over the last 70 years, an idea that we need to get water into rivers and downstream as fast as possible. And of course, in a changing climate, we're realizing that there's perversity and a lack of join up around that. So we've got a moment in time, the government are out to consultation about a land use framework. And I'm really interested in the thought of, well, how about in some places, in some situations where it's sensible to do so, actually we reverse that thought, particularly in upper catchments. I mean, what we do know, Paul, is that we need the triangulation that you and I have talked about a lot between the whole of civic society in order to make this work. And Jonathan's analysis of the money suggests that we need both public money, we need private money, and we need the skills and enthusiasm and capabilities in the third sector as well. So, short answer is yes, but it's complicated.
Caroline, one of the things in our discussions that came up early on is that the Crown Estate has also made a net zero commitment on your rural properties. And you're also owner of the seabed and a massive facilitator of offshore wind. But you also are potentially a buyer of carbon credits. And so you're both a landowner, but you're also potentially a source of financing internally and externally for this. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's a really interesting spot to be in, actually, because you kind of, sometimes in these conversations, you sort of end up dividing the debate between sort of demand and supply, providers and buyers. And actually, it's really interesting to sort of straddle that space, if that's the right word, and understand it from both sides. Because I think you're absolutely right. As an organisation, like many, we've committed to decarbonisation trajectory, and with the portfolio and particularly the supply chain that we engage with, that's a big challenge, right? That's extensive. And I think whilst we're very fortunate to have the opportunity, particularly if we accelerate and scale up habitat creation restoration, which gives us some nature-based solutions to that, we're still in the space where we need to think about how are we going to make that really happen in the timescale and the kind of targets that we set for ourselves. So we're really working with a really diverse range of partners who are potential providers, and also understanding the barriers to accessing them. Why doesn't that investable proposition work? Why doesn't it work from the side if you're the provider, if you're creating the habitat, if you're building the wetland, if you're spending the money that that Harry's organisation has been spending? What does that world look like? And then how does that dock in to the buyer side? Because I think that's the other challenge, isn't it? And we often talk about having parity of language so that you can realise these opportunities and get people to recognise that investment solution that they're looking for, it is actually this incredible natural flood management project that's happening. It's just perhaps the language that you use to describe the demand that you need and the supply that can meet it isn't yet the same. So I think that's a really exciting space. And as an organisation that spends time in both camps, if you will, we really see the opportunity for ourselves, but we're not alone in this, but for ourselves certainly to help bridge that gap in understanding and help drive scale in that way.
So the one group that we've this is a conference about insurance and kind of insurers off the hook here in two ways. So I'm going to press you a little bit if you don't mind. The Flood Re is sitting on about just short of $1 billion in assets, and I know you've been very imaginative on how you might through scale up some of the test cases you've done and said there could be a case to try and liberate a little bit of that to be an NFM. But also there's a role of the insurance industry as a whole, which if we were to build out these 1,000 wetlands would be beneficiaries of what would, at least in the initial instance, be state spending, because you could get the EA and National Highways to reallocate more to NFM, and there would be less flooding and insurers would benefit. So how do you get the industry to be engaged and to liberate finance for this in a way that really scales this and also saves money for the taxpayer?
Sure. So there's two parts to that two-part question, I guess. And on the scheme and its assets, so those are there for the running of the scheme, and Flood Re is seen as one of the ones that's holding up. So you see California not holding up. You see the states, having difficulty maintaining insurability. So that is coming under pressure everywhere, and we are holding up, but it's a different world than we were in, say, 2 years ago. That being said, there's a proposal as part of our, we ask the government every so often to change the rules. There's a proposal to do what Pool Re has done. Pool Re is the terrorism reinsurance. Take 1% of its asset base and apply it to essentially innovation. So, innovation could mean a lot of things, but this is very innovative, so this is one potential application. That's in the government's hands. In terms of what the insurance industry can do, so a lot of what we hear is about resilience in the future is that it's going to be digital and natural. So we've obviously got the nature part, but digitizing that is actually where this comes in, is having the demonstration that this stuff works, that it reduces risk. So usually they say there's been a thing of not having data. Well, 2 of us have data points up on that screen. Those are probably like the only 2 out there. And so we're building out that demonstration so that this can be factored into flood models, which is what is used in pricing. But so here's where the tough part comes in, or the part that no one ever wants to hear, which is that actually insurers don't benefit. So the risk comes down, it gets factored into the flood models, and people's prices are contained. So the beneficiaries are the homeowners, the businesses, et cetera, which is why it ends up being a public investment, which is why the public steps in, because as many people said, it's tough to identify an individual beneficiary, it's much more collective. So the point is getting into the models, which contains premiums, and then that creates the incentive to implement these things from the public perspective, but the insurers themselves are much more interested at the investment stage, so that those huge pools of capital, of which we have one, but ours is heavily limited, but the investment delivery forum, which Rebecca spoke about before, being an example. So that's why it has to get to a safe asset that the PRA approves of, Prudential Regulation Associate, I forget. Yeah. Authority, exactly. And then it can be invested. Yeah.
Nick, I'm going to give you the final word. And this is really around, I think what this is illustrated is we're at the early stage of thinking through all the different ways to do this. And from a finance model, from a land use model, from a data model, from a beneficiary model, we're going to work this out. One of the things you at Barclays have been thinking about is how you might create interesting financial instruments which can take the climate co-benefit revenue streams and monetize them in some way, impact bonds, flood bonds, and other products. Early stages, but give us a glimpse of what you think that could look like in a year or 2 if we did all our homework well.
So I should start by saying I'm not the expert on bonds or the credit markets, but we do have experts who are working on this now. We've got 10 people who are working on this as we speak, some of which taking from, as I mentioned, expertise from other parts of the world where this is seen to work. We're working very closely with the Environment Bank, where we've already started to match up our 38,000 farmers with home builders. So to get the biodiversity net gain benefits flowing through to our farming community as well. So we are active in this space already. And I think, it's nascent, but it's very doable. And I think the reason why we are committed to this next 9 months and really rolling up our sleeves and getting stuck in is that I think the critical part of this is getting the financing piece right. Because in a way, the dependencies with 1 or 2 exceptions, but with most of the dependencies so far has been around philanthropic giving in this space, which has got us so far. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't deliver a scale. And I think the ambition that actually Barnaby spoke about earlier, which is, I'm almost going to call him Barnaby Beveridge now, I think, but the sort of Beveridge kind of scale of ambition to really kind of remodel what floods mean to this country and the benefits that can flow from preventing those. It requires an intervention at scale, and I think finance has to be a critical part of that.
So we're being yanked off the stage. I'm being told, please wrap up, and we have lunch to eat as well. So we're going to end, and I'm going to end with saying, if we close our eyes several years ago and said why we set up the conduit, it is for conversations like this, because we don't have a dog in this fight other than wanting there to be a solution. And what we're trying to do is find all the innovative ways that everybody can collaborate with each other and solve this together, because this is a problem that we cannot do in isolation. It will require a community of people, Ubuntu group of people. We are I am because we are, and that is going to become necessary. So we want to enlist you into this. I've been told I may not take any questions, and we will discuss all of this during lunch and in subsequent events. But please go up to lunch, and we will follow up after lunch. But thank you so much.